evening, board members and stakeholders of the Pickens County Schools. I am here tonight to present to you some strategies for implementing professional development for assessment as learning, and this is through some research that I've done with Piedmont College. The first thing I'm going to walk you through are our current assessment practices in our school districts. Just a quick overview. So in this slide, you see some images of typical pep rallies that are held or assemblies that are held before typical high-stakes testing takes place in our schools. Often in elementary school this is done. And these can often bring positive or possibly mixed feelings from teachers who are generally in charge of planning and getting their students motivated about these tests. Here are some more images that are a little bit more negative in conjunction with the kind of high-stakes testing that we are all familiar with in our system and that we have to do. So one is a student who looks frustrated. This image I really liked because it says here, local decision making, joy of learning, and instructional time, and it has just a vacuum of testing, high-stakes testing. It's just sucking up all of that good stuff that we as teachers and administrators and stakeholders value in our system. The cheating scandal in Atlanta in 2011, I think everybody remembers that is sort of a negative thing associated with high-stakes testing. And really all of these things, so our CCRPI, our milestones, our teacher keys, these are all assessments of learning. Now, assessment of learning means that there is a test given that assesses the student's knowledge on a particular topic or a few particular topics. So it's really external versus internal. So it's not knowledge the student is creating, it's knowledge being tested from an outside source, okay? Not even teachers are making these. These are made by educational teaching companies, educational testing companies. So that's something that if you're not familiar with these terms, we're going to explore a little further in the slides. This next slide is a little bit different because it shows assessment for learning and as learning. So we will delve deeper into this, but just as an overview, you can see how these pictures reflect a very different learning atmosphere. We have students working together as a team. We have the word teamwork and skills and success and vision. We have creativity kind of represented down here in the corner. We have self-assessment, again, more collaboration. A big thing is student motivation, which assessment for and as learning helps. We also have some assessment examples with portfolios. Now, this is a way that teachers can assess student progress in a formative and even summative way with portfolios. That's not high-stakes testing, but that does show cumulatively how the students are learning and they're growing from the beginning of the school year to the end, or from one beginning point to the end. The two types of assessment that I want to go over are formative and summative. I mentioned these before, but formative assessment really is like a day-to-day type of assessment that teachers, we use this all the time in our classrooms, and it helps students learn and practice. So this is used throughout the course of the class. It's used in order to identify gaps and improve learning. So it's a quick and easy way to say, oh, these students are lacking this skill. I need to supplement this. And then there are various approaches that support specific student needs. Oftentimes, this is where our differentiated assessment types come into play. Now, summative assessments are necessary, but they're less common. They're not necessarily done every day. They're really done at the end of an instructional period. So they should be aligned to learning goals or learning targets. And at the end of that period of time when the teacher teaches that learning target, it's then assessed as a summative assessment. And it's in order to collect evidence of student knowledge and the skills or proficiency overall. And this is often done via learning products such as presentations, it can be performances, or some kind of cumulative assessment such as a portfolio. It could also be a multiple choice, sort of a unit exam type of scenario. I'll now touch on the three types of assessment just compared side by side. The first one I want to touch on is assessment of learning. So that's that first Georgia milestones, the EOCs. This is that type of test. They are, as we discussed, external, they're summative, they're high stakes, meaning you get one shot and then that's it. The student is not directly involved in any way in the creation of this exam, nor are teachers from that school. And then feedback is often missing for students. So while teachers and schools receive a raw score from that student, a calculated score, the very specific questions the students got wrong are not communicated back to the students, since these are typically given at the end of the year. This is more of a, think of this as a destination. So it's not thinking about really like the journey that takes a student there. It's all about how the student performs on this one thing, this one summative high stakes test. Now, in contrast to that, the two here, assessment as learning and assessment for learning, are more journeys. So it's really more about the process, how students are learning and how students are thinking about their own learning. So assessment for learning is thinking about assessment that helps students learn. So it's classroom based, meaning the teacher or the professionals that are in the room create the assessments in real time, often on the spot, even if they need to. And it can change depending on how that the student is doing or group of students is doing. It's very individualized. It is formative, so daily kind of check-ins, quizzes, conversations. There's a lot of dialogue involved with this kind of assessment. There are clear learning targets, and there's direct and timely feedback, meaning the student understands right away that they didn't get something correct or that they're missing, they have a gap in their knowledge, and the teacher can immediately start to correct that. And self and teacher assess, so again, the student is beginning to be made aware of where they're lacking those skills and can help fill that in. And it is a continuous process. Assessment as learning is similar, but it's really a metacognitive process. So it's really thinking about students and how they think about their own learning. And this is so important because this concept of thinking about how we learn is going to be something that students can and should take with them for life. And they can go about really helping themselves learn. So it does teach self-monitoring and self-reflection, which are all things that we as educators strive to teach our students so that one day they can exist in the world without us. And again, it's a continuous process. So the next question is, are we assessing students properly here in our district? So what is proper assessment? So teachers who are using the following 5 keys are assessing properly. And those 5 keys are, according to Stiggins, Chapowis, and Arter: clear purpose, clear target, sound design, effective communication, and then student involvement. So students should be ideally involved somehow in making that assessment to the most extent that they can be. And this is simply a chart that explains what kind of assessment is needed based on the type of target that the teacher is going for. So if the band teacher is trying to teach a scale, that would maybe fall under a performance skill, and a multiple choice question like a selected response is probably not going to measure that very well. Whereas a performance assessment, so observing and assessing skills as they're being performed, is the way to go for that. So on the other hand, I wanted to just point out that our high stakes tests typically test knowledge, and selected response, which means multiple choice, it's considered a good way to assess, but it's not the strongest. In fact, there are 2 others that are stronger, which are the written response and then the personal communication. So are we assessing students properly? As you could tell from the slides before, if we refers to the state of Georgia and high stakes testing, then no, we're not. So authentic and valid assessment must contain at least most of those 5 keys. Our milestones or end of course tests do not provide feedback from which students can learn. So students don't get their responses back and say, oh, I missed this, here's how I need to learn from it. There's absolutely no student involvement and very little teacher involvement used in the creation of those assessments. Those are designed by testing companies, and while they do pull professionals in, not from every single school. That just would not be practical. And then finally, they use only selected response and limited open-ended or written response. There's no personal communication tested on this. There's certainly no performance skills tested. So it really leaves out a large number of students who may perform much better on, let's say, performance skills. So my recommendations for you, Board of Education members and stakeholders, is to implement some professional learning centered around assessment for and assessment as learning, because as we can see in my earlier presentation, that is really where we get student motivation pulled in. That's where we get meaningful, authentic, formative assessment and data from teachers and from students so that we can actually improve student learning in a real way. I also would think that we need to allow differentiation in how schools can show the mastery of standards. We might consider portfolios and performance assessment as a summative grade as opposed to perhaps a typical final exam. I think that teachers and administrators really need to be trusted that they know what to do for their students. And then finally, budget more towards professional learning, and I will touch on that later. So part of what you had asked me to research was how could we go about involving teachers? How could we go about implementing professional development? So some of the goals that I came up with were to familiarize teachers and stakeholders with assessment for learning and assessment as learning. So these are things that teachers do anyway, but they've probably never put a name to those things. So I think it would be very wise to create some common expectations for formative assessment, and not just expectations, but really model it and get teachers practicing this. So, and that's my third point, to teach and model best practice for clear learning targets and feedback. So teachers need to be able to see this in action from other teachers and also be able to practice it themselves. And finally, to change the culture of assessment in our district. So right now, assessment is kind of a dirty word, and we really need to change that. Assessment shouldn't be something that when we hear it, we freeze up. It should be something that is just, it's a culture in our school. So some keys to successful professional learning are to make sure that we go with non-traditional. So the traditional professional learning is that sort of one and done workshop type scenario. We want to go with something non-traditional that's actually need-based and embedded and ongoing. So that means that it's not a one-time thing. It's more like a professional learning community where we meet on a weekly basis, or we meet for a period of time, and these things stay in the forefront of our mind. There also needs to be stakeholder input in the design, which means as teachers and really even students need to have some say in how this is designed, since we are the ones who are going to be using this. So one study that was done by Bayer in 2014 found that really the number one thing teachers said or participants said about professional development is that they complained they had no time for active engagement. And I feel that we have all probably experienced this, where we're sitting in a meeting and we're listening, but we don't get to engage hands-on, and we need to change that. Professional learning that is successful also needs to be implemented in a way that's focused on building culture. It needs to be accessible. So focus on building culture means that it takes into account what's already happening in the building and doesn't just come in with something completely new. Accessible means that it's available to teachers. So whether that means via a Zoom meeting, whether it means live and in person, or both, we need to make this accessible. It means that there's engagement and hands-on activities as well in order for this to be successful. In regards to budget and our current financial impact when it comes to professional learning, this is from the Pickens County School District General Fund in the 2020 budget. The most amended one is from June. And I just want to point out that currently instructional staff training, which would include professional development, in the general fund is only 0.2% of the budget, and that is actually the smallest slice by a pretty good bit. So my final recommendations going forward are to form a committee, and this committee should be comprised of various stakeholders. So teachers, administrators, possibly students, and other staff members from the school. And there should also be subcommittees for budgeting and grant writing. And this could potentially help if no money could be found in the general fund to allocate towards more professional learning for teachers, even though it's just at that 0.2%, then perhaps a grant could be written in order to help fund some of the professional learning. And finally, I think that there can be a search for teachers who are already implementing some of these formative assessment practices and best practices in their own classrooms now, and those teachers can be the leaders to help drive the change and culture of the school. I hope you have learned something from this presentation, and if you need me, I can be reached at my school email. Thank you all so much for your time and for your attention. Have a good evening.